Have you ever felt like something inside you changed, and no matter how hard you try to act the way you used to, think the way you used to, or see the world the way you used to, you simply can't anymore? As if some kind of veil had fallen from your eyes and now certain truths are exposed in a way that is impossible to ignore? This usually feels frightening, because at first it seems like confusion, it seems like mental exhaustion, it can even feel like overthinking. But it's not just that. In many cases, this is the exact moment when consciousness begins to break through the comfortable illusion most people live in. There comes a point in life when you stop consuming appearances and start perceiving structures. You stop hearing only words and begin noticing intentions. You stop looking at isolated behaviors and begin seeing recurring patterns. And when that happens, it's not only your view of others that changes, your view of yourself also begins to collapse. Because perceiving too much is never a neutral experience. Perceiving too much comes with an emotional price. You begin to feel out of place in shallow conversations, disconnected from artificial environments, impatient with social masks, and deeply unsettled by how easily so many people accept living on autopilot. Carl Jung said that, who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakes. And that is exactly the problem with awakening: once you see, you cannot unsee. Once the mind crosses certain levels of perception, returning to the previous innocence becomes impossible. What once seemed normal starts to feel strange. What once seemed true starts to feel staged. And what once held you emotionally begins to lose its grip, because your psyche starts a silent process of individuation, the gradual separation between authentic consciousness and the character the world expected you to be. But almost no one talks about the uncomfortable side of this. People romanticize self-knowledge, romanticize mental awakening, romanticize emotional intelligence, but they don't tell you that seeing more also means losing many of the illusions that once kept you at peace. They don't tell you that the greater the clarity, the lower the tolerance for convenient lies. They don't tell you that there is a specific pain in perceiving psychological games, subtle manipulations, empty relationships, hidden neediness, and masked interests in places where you once saw only ordinary coexistence. It's as if your mind starts assembling a puzzle non-stop without asking your permission. And maybe that is exactly what is happening to you right now. Maybe you've started noticing that certain people always repeat the same emotional patterns. Maybe you've realized that many relationships are sustained by need, not by connection. Maybe you're feeling an internal distancing, as if you are physically present but mentally growing farther and farther away from most people. And this distance is not born from arrogance, it is born from perception. It comes from the fact that some realizations, once they click, completely change the way you interpret human behavior, society, and even your own identity. The question is, what exactly are these perceptions that, once awakened, make it impossible to go back to who you used to be? What does depth psychology explain about this mental point of no return? And why do so many people feel like they are changing inside without being able to put into words what is happening? Because there is an unsettling detail in all of this, and it is precisely this detail that begins to separate those who merely live, from those who have finally started to see. And before we continue, I want to ask you something very simple, but something that helps this kind of content keep reaching the people who truly need to hear these messages. If at any point in these words you have felt a strange discomfort, that feeling of, it seems like he's talking directly to me, then leave your like now. It may seem like just one click, but for the channel it's a sign that this kind of awakening, self-knowledge, and depth psychology needs to reach more people who are going through this exact process in silence. And I really want to hear from you. So comment below, I can't unsee it anymore, if you feel like you've started noticing things that used to go unnoticed. Or, if you prefer, comment on the moment you realized your mind was no longer the same. Because when you put this into words, you stop feeling like you're going through this transformation alone, and other people carrying the same feeling end up recognizing themselves in your comment. And of course, If this is the kind of video that touches parts of the mind almost no one reaches, subscribe to the channel right now. Because the next few minutes are going to dig deeper into layers that normally stay hidden behind human behavior, relationships, and consciousness itself. And honestly, the further we go, the harder it becomes to ignore what lies beneath all of this. Because there is a very clear first sign that this point of no return has already started inside you, and almost no one notices when it appears. The first sign that you have perceived something irreversible is when things start losing their charm even though nothing external has changed. The same conversations keep happening. The same people remain around you. The same environments still exist. But your internal experience inside them is no longer the same. There is a strange mental fatigue in participating in superficial interactions, a kind of silent discomfort in hearing predictable speeches, repeated complaints, copied opinions, and performed emotions. You are there, but a part of your mind seems to say all the time, something is off about all of this. And this perception does not arise because you became negative. It arises because your consciousness started picking up what used to remain invisible. It's as if you left one frequency and entered another. What once seemed spontaneous now feels conditioned. What once seemed sincere now sounds convenient. You begin to notice how many people do not say what they think, they say what they expect will be accepted. They do not show who they are, they show the socially safe version of themselves. And when you start seeing this over and over, something inevitable happens. Social innocence disappears. Carl Jung said that most of humanity lives identified with the persona, the psychological mask built to function in society. The problem is that when your perception deepens, you begin to see people's persona before you see the person themselves. You notice the rehearsed smile, the adapted opinion, the performative outrage, the self-serving kindness, the fake confidence. And this does not mean you became cold. It simply means your mind began distinguishing essence from performance. And that distinction changes everything. Because once you realize that much of human interaction is sustained by fear, need for validation, emotional emptiness, silent competition, and the search for approval, it becomes very difficult to keep reacting the same way. You stop being easily impressed. You stop believing every display of affection. You stop getting pulled into every victim narrative. You stop accepting every act of kindness without questioning the intention behind it. Not because you lost sensitivity, but because you gained psychological insight. And this is where the deeper discomfort begins. You start feeling like you are seeing backstage while most people only see the show. While many are still discussing the scene, you are already observing the script. While many are fixated on the words, you are perceiving the motivations behind them. While many buy into versions, you start seeing patterns. And this ability to perceive patterns radically changes the way you feel the world, because the world stops being only what it shows on the surface. Maybe that is why certain company has started exhausting you for no apparent reason. Maybe that is why some conversations feel unbearably slow. Maybe that is why you have become more silent, not because you have nothing to say, but because you realize not every environment can hold the level of depth that now exists within you. There is a kind of loneliness that is born when the mind awakens to layers the collective has not yet questioned. You remain surrounded by people, but internally you feel that very few are truly seeing the same landscape you are seeing. And this creates a confusing mix of clarity and distance. Clarity because you understand more. Distance because understanding more also separates you from certain shared illusions. Jung said that, thinking is difficult, therefore most people judge. And when you internalize this phrase, you begin to notice how much the world is structured around automatic reactions. People do not observe deeply, they label. They do not analyze intentions, they assume. They do not investigate emotions, they project. But your mind, for some reason, has stopped being satisfied with quick answers. It wants to see the machinery, not just the movement. And this is the detail many people do not understand. Once you start seeing the psychological machinery behind human attitudes, going back to believing only in appearances becomes almost impossible. Your mind becomes quieter on the outside, but infinitely more active on the inside. You begin observing expressions, pauses, inconsistencies, repetitions, subtle shifts in energy, contradictions between speech and behavior, as if some internal part of you were collecting evidence all the time. And the most unsettling part is that this process does not stop with other people. At some point, this same lens starts turning toward you, and that is when the experience becomes far more intense. If this feeling resonates with you, comment simply, "I see beyond." Because the next step of this awakening is not seeing others more clearly, it is noticing things within yourself that perhaps you have avoided your entire life. And when this lens turns inward, the first thing that happens is not relief, it is conflict. Because seeing others is already uncomfortable, but seeing yourself without psychological makeup is an even more brutal experience. You begin to realize that many decisions you called choice were actually fear. Many silences you called maturity were repression. Many relationships you defended as important were merely emotional attachment. And many versions of yourself you considered natural were characters built to survive, to please, or to avoid rejection. This is the part almost everyone tries to run from. Because looking outward requires observation. Looking inward requires courage. And maybe you have noticed this without even being able to explain it. Suddenly, old memories begin returning with a different meaning. Situations you once considered normal begin to feel strange. Certain humiliations you minimized start to gain weight. Certain emotional concessions that once seemed like love begin to reveal dependence. You mentally revisit your own history and realize there is far more shadow there than you were willing to admit. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This sentence is devastating when it truly lands. Because it suggests that much of what you felt, chose, and repeated may not have been freedom at all, but internal programming. Unseen wounds. Unnamed fears. Hidden emotional needs holding the steering wheel of your existence. And when that realization hits, there is no comfortable return. Because now you begin to suspect yourself. You begin to ask, did I really want this, or was I only conditioned to want it? Did this relationship truly make me feel good, or was I just afraid of being alone? Am I really like this, or did I adapt in order to be accepted? And these questions open deep cracks in identity. The solid image you had of who you were begins to fail. A strange feeling of unfamiliarity appears. As if you were discovering that you spent years living inside a mental house decorated by other people's expectations. That is why many people describe this period as confusion, anxiety, estrangement, or psychic exhaustion. But deep down, it is not just confusion. It is the disintegration of an old narrative. The mind is tearing apart explanations that once helped keep you functional. And that hurts because the ego hates losing its certainties. The ego would rather cling to a familiar lie than face a truth that demands reconstruction. But once certain patterns have been seen, you can no longer pretend not to know. You can no longer internally sustain the same innocence about your own story. You begin to see your automatic reactions in real time. You notice the urge to please. You notice the fear of confrontation. You notice the need for validation. You notice the drive to prove your worth. You notice the tendency to shrink yourself in some environments and perform superiority in others. It is as if an inner camera has been switched on, now exposing the emotional backstage that used to remain invisible. And this creates a disturbing inner question: who am I without these mechanisms? Who would I be without the need to be understood? Who would I be without the need to appear strong? Who would I be without the character I learned to operate through? This is one of the most quietly painful phases of deep self-knowledge, because you have not yet arrived at the new version of yourself, but you have already begun losing the old one. You exist between worlds. You no longer fully identify with who you were, but you still do not know who you are becoming. And this psychological limbo makes many people think they are falling apart, when in reality they are waking up. But there is an even more unsettling element to all of this. As you realize that you have carried masks for years, you begin to suspect that the people around you are carrying them too. And then relationships enter an entirely different level of strangeness. Because it is no longer enough to notice what you were hiding from yourself, you begin to notice what others are hiding from themselves as well. This is the point where coexistence stops being just coexistence and turns into constant reading. If this resonates with you, comment, "I am truly seeing myself." Because what comes next is not just questioning your identity, it is understanding why the human mind creates these masks, and why so few people can handle it when those masks begin to fall. There is a deep psychological reason why this discomfort intensifies so much when you start perceiving too much. The human mind was built to protect stability, not necessarily truth. And that means that for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime, we learn to wear mental layers that allow us to belong, to be accepted, to avoid pain, and to keep functioning. But those layers come at a cost. They distance consciousness from what is genuine. Carl Jung called this process the split between persona and shadow. The persona is the face we show the world. The shadow is everything we repress, hide, or deny within ourselves in order to keep that face intact. The critical point is that most people spend their entire lives pouring energy into the persona while running from the shadow. They want to appear balanced, but they hide anger. They want to appear detached, but they hide neediness. They want to appear secure, but they hide fear. They want to appear good, but they hide resentment, envy, frustration, and impulses they will not admit even in thought. Now imagine what happens when your perception starts identifying this mechanism. You stop believing that people are only what they display. You begin to understand that behind the excessively kind person there may be a desperate need for approval. Behind the aggressive person there may be a profound sense of powerlessness. Behind the constantly critical person there may be unrecognized envy. Behind the person who acts strong there may be a brutal fear of seeming weak. Suddenly, human behavior gains psychological depth. Nothing feels as simple as it once did. And this becomes an inner dividing line because it changes the way you read the world. You stop reacting only to the surface of events and begin interpreting their emotional undercurrents. An argument is no longer just an argument. It may be a wounded ego. Distance is no longer just distance. It may be unconscious defense. Excessive exposure is no longer just self-esteem. It may be compensation for emptiness. Everything starts to have a second layer. This is exactly where most of the people around you begin to seem predictable and, at the same time, mysterious. Predictable because the emotional patterns become clear. Mysterious because you realize how little even they understand why they do what they do. And this creates an almost claustrophobic feeling in social settings. Because while everyone else is dealing only with words and appearances, you are seeing underground currents of insecurity, validation seeking, competition, projection, fear of abandonment, and need for control. Your mind does not just see people talking. It sees psychologies colliding. Maybe that is why some relationships have started losing their spontaneity for you. Not because you stopped liking people, but because it became hard not to notice what lies behind every gesture. You begin to notice who only approaches when they need something. Who talks about themselves non-stop to compensate for feeling invisible. Who subtly tries to diminish you to regain a sense of control. Who performs agreement to avoid exclusion. Who performs happiness to hide internal collapse. It is exhausting. Exhausting because your mind can no longer consume reality on autopilot. And there is an even stronger detail. when you understand the concept of the shadow, you realize that you are not just seeing flaws in others. You are seeing repressed human fragments trying to express themselves unconsciously. This creates a strange mixture of lucidity and compassion. You understand more, but you also distance yourself more. Because understanding the mechanism does not make the performance disappear, it only makes the performance visible. Jung said that, no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That changes everything because it shows that true mental awakening is not about feeling superior or special. It is about being able to face the structural darkness of the human psyche without numbing yourself. And very few people can do that without entering a crisis. Because the more you perceive the collective shadow, your own and that of others, the more the world begins to look like one vast emotional theater where almost no one knows exactly who they are, yet everyone fiercely defends their character. But here comes the most disorienting question of all: if almost every behavior is guided by unconscious content, then how much of your life up to this point was really choice, and how much was invisible repetition? If this stirred something inside you, comment, "The masks are falling." Because the next step of this perception is even more disturbing, discovering that it is not only other people who repeat patterns, you too are trapped in cycles you may never have noticed. And this is where perception stops being only about seeing more clearly, and turns into an almost frightening discovery. You begin to notice that your entire life has been built on repetition. Repetition of choices. Repetition of reactions. Repetition of types of people. Repetition of pains with different names. On the outside, the settings change. But inside, there is an emotional script insisting on reenacting itself. Maybe you have already lived this without realizing it. The friends change, but the feeling of not belonging remains. The relationships change, but the sense of not being fully seen remains. The goals change, but the emptiness after achieving them still appears. The inner promises change, but certain fears keep making decisions in silence. At some point, you ask yourself, why does it feel like I am moving, yet always returning to the same place? And that question is powerful because it marks the difference between someone who merely suffers, and someone who begins observing the architecture of their own suffering. Carl Jung understood this as the unconscious compulsion of psychic repetition. What has not been understood internally tends to repeat externally until it is recognized. In other words, the psyche creates different scenarios to confront you with the same wound while you still have not learned to see it. And that is why so many people feel as though life has different chapters, but the same pain underneath. You think you are choosing someone new, but you are choosing the same emotional pattern in a different body. You think you are reacting to a new problem, but you are activating the same childhood fear dressed in different clothes. You think you are pursuing a new dream, but sometimes you are only chasing the same old need for validation. When that realization hits, something inside trembles. Because perception finally shows you that maybe it was not the world sabotaging you so many times, maybe you were unconsciously cooperating with the same cycles. And I know that is uncomfortable to hear. Because it is far more comfortable to believe that everything was bad luck, coincidence, outside injustice, or entirely someone else's fault. But there comes a point in mental awakening when consciousness stops looking only for culprits and starts looking for patterns. And patterns are much harder to ignore, because they reveal participation. You begin looking back and seeing invisible lines connecting situations that once seemed isolated. You realize that in many moments you gave too much to avoid abandonment. In others, you shut down too much to avoid vulnerability. In others, you proved yourself too much in search of recognition. In others, you accepted crumbs because deep down you did not believe you deserved fullness. All of this forms a map. A silent psychological map. And the most striking part is that once you see this map, you can no longer call coincidence what is clearly pattern. Your mind starts putting the pieces together automatically. I always stay silent when I should speak up. I always become suspicious when someone gets close. I always need to show that I am okay. I always run when something gets too deep. These always begin jumping into consciousness like alarms. And then a paradoxical feeling emerges: as much as this hurts, it also gives your power back. Because suffering without understanding creates helplessness. But perceiving the mechanism creates the possibility of breaking it. For the first time, you feel that maybe your life was not a random sequence of events, maybe it was a highly coherent sequence of unconscious material asking to be seen. And that is a massive turning point, because the chaos begins to make sense. But there is an almost inevitable consequence to this lucidity. When you understand your own cycles, you begin to see the cycles of the people around you with much sharper clarity. And then it becomes difficult to participate in certain dynamics without noticing that everyone is compulsively repeating themselves, as if they were trapped on invisible tracks. The question stops being, "What is happening?" and becomes, "How is no one seeing this?" If this perception speaks to your story, comment, "I recognize the pattern." Because the next stage of this process is not just seeing repetition, it is understanding why. After that, you begin feeling more and more distant from most people without being able to stop it. There comes a moment in life when truth stops being information, and becomes an open wound. Because while you live on autopilot, while you believe the ready-made versions you were handed about love, about friendship, about work, about success, about who you were supposed to be, everything feels manageable. Yes, there are discomforts, there are frustrations, there is an exhaustion that is hard to explain, but there is still a kind of anesthesia. You keep moving because you still have not fully seen what lies underneath. But once certain patterns become visible, that anesthesia disappears. And this is exactly where the pain of psychological awakening lies. Maybe you started noticing it in the little things. In the superficial conversations that once seemed normal and now sound empty. In relationships where you finally noticed unequal exchanges, emotional manipulation, silences loaded with self-interest. In social dynamics where smiles hide rivalry, approval hides fear, and closeness often hides convenience. Suddenly, you are not just seeing people, you are seeing mechanisms. You are not just hearing words, you are hearing intentions. And that changes everything. Carl Jung said that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And perhaps that is one of the most disturbing things a person can hear when they begin to wake up. Because it suggests that a large part of human suffering does not come only from the external world, but from the inability to see the invisible forces that govern us. When you begin to perceive those forces, within yourself and within others, reality stops being simple. It gains layers. It gains shadows. And worst of all, it becomes irreversible. Because after you understand why certain people lie while looking straight into your eyes, you never listen naively again. After you understand why some relationships drained you even without major fights, you never call it just a rough patch again. After you realize how many environments depend on your distraction in order to keep controlling you, you never participate in the same way again. It is as if an invisible lens has been placed over your consciousness, and now everything that once seemed casual reveals a hidden pattern. But there is something even deeper here, and perhaps more uncomfortable. It is not only the world that changes when you perceive more. You change. Your sensitivity increases. Your tolerance for what is fake decreases. Your patience for emotional games disappears. Your desire to belong begins to clash with your need for truth. And this is the point where many people enter a crisis without even knowing how to name what is happening. They think they are becoming cold. They think they are becoming antisocial. They think they are pulling away from everything because of arrogance or exhaustion. But in reality, they are simply suffering the psychological impact of no longer being able to pretend they do not see. This hurts because awakening does not deliver only clarity, it tears away illusions that once gave you comfort. And illusions, no matter how fragile, function as emotional shelter. The illusion that everyone is sincere. The illusion that reciprocity is automatic. The illusion that effort is always recognized. The illusion that if you are good, the world will be good back. When these structures collapse, you feel not only frustration, you feel grief. A silent grief for the more innocent version of yourself. Maybe that is why, lately, you have felt a strange mix of lucidity and loneliness. As if you understand more, but fit in less. As if you are waking up mentally, but at the same time losing the ease of living among those who are still asleep. And this contradiction is deeply confusing. Because one part of you feels relief for finally understanding old pains. But another part misses when everything felt lighter simply because you did not see so much. Jung understood this when he spoke about the process of individuation, the path in which the human being begins separating from collective masks in order to find their own consciousness. But this path is not beautiful the way people sell it. It is uncomfortable. It is lonely. It is full of internal ruptures. Because to perceive means you no longer fit inside simple narratives. And when you no longer fit inside the simple, the superficial starts to suffocate you. You begin to notice repeated patterns in people, promises never followed by action, affection that only appears when there is self-interest, attention that disappears when you stop being useful. You begin to notice patterns in yourself as well, why you kept insisting on accepting less than you deserved, why you silenced your intuition to preserve bonds, why you confused crumbs with connection. And this double perception, external and internal, is devastating, because it leaves no room for the old comfortable blindness. The most unsettling part is that many around you may not understand this change. Some will say you are exaggerating. Others will say you have become too negative. Some may even try to convince you that thinking too much is unhealthy. But deep down, what unsettles them is something else. People who begin to see patterns become harder to manipulate. Harder to distract. Harder to keep inside old roles. And that naturally creates resistance. So you begin to feel that there is a distance growing between who you are becoming and everything you once accepted without question. And this distance does not appear all at once, it emerges in details, in small discomforts, in long silences, in a persistent feeling that something is being revealed all the time, something that no longer allows emotional return to the innocence that once protected you. And perhaps the quietest part of all this is what happens afterward. Because once you can no longer unsee certain patterns, the world stays the same on the outside, but inside you, something has shifted position. It is as if reality stops being something you merely live in and becomes something you observe while living in it. And that small difference completely changes the way you feel everything. You begin to sense the weight of intention behind simple words. How are you, that is not care, but protocol. A smile that is not connection, but social strategy. A compliment that is not recognition, but image management. And it is not that these things did not exist before, it is that now you can see them. And seeing, at this level, does not bring only clarity, it brings emotional responsibility. Carl Jung spoke about confronting the shadow as an inevitable process for anyone seeking consciousness. But what few understand is that the shadow is not only inside you, it also appears in others, in relationships, in the invisible dynamics that organize behavior. And when you begin recognizing that, there is a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone, but with perceiving too much while everyone else is still operating on autopilot. This creates a mismatch. You hear what is said, but you also hear what is not said. You feel what is shown, but also what is hidden. And little by little, you begin to realize that much of human interaction is not about truth, it is about emotional negotiation. About image maintenance. About psychological survival in small social scenarios. And here an inner tension is born that is hard to explain. Because one part of you does not want to lose this perception. It brings lucidity, it brings power, it brings a strange feeling of silent command over human behavior. But another part of you feels the cost of it, the exhaustion of seeing too much, the difficulty of relaxing into innocence, the burden of perceiving intentions where there once was lightness. And it is exactly at this point that something begins reorganizing inside your mind without your conscious awareness. You start filtering more. Pulling away from empty interactions. Questioning patterns that once felt automatic. And without noticing it, your way of thinking stops being reactive and becomes observant. You no longer respond only to what happens, you interpret what lies behind what happens. But this opens a new layer of discomfort. If you see patterns in others, you inevitably begin seeing patterns in yourself as well. And that changes everything. Because now there is no longer any possibility of placing yourself completely as the victim of situations. You begin to see your own repetitions, your own permissions, your own unconscious choices inside cycles that once seemed like nothing but fate. And when that happens, the mind enters a strange state of expansion and restlessness at the same time. Expansion because you understand more. Restlessness because you can no longer return to the previous mode of functioning. It is as if something has been activated and can no longer be turned off. And maybe that is why, after this point, the question changes in a subtle but profound way, because what starts to emerge is no longer just, why are people like this, but something far more uncomfortable and unavoidable, something that has not yet been fully named here. If you made it this far, it is because some part of this conversation did not go unnoticed inside you. And maybe that already says more about you than about the video itself. If this message made sense to you in any way, if something here resonated with what you have already been perceiving in silence, then subscribe to the channel. The goal here is not to hand you ready-made answers, but to keep opening these spaces for reflection that most people avoid. Also leave your like, because that helps this video reach more people who may be going through this exact same process of perception and inner change, but still have not found words for it. And comment below, when did you feel that you started seeing things differently? Or if this is still happening to you. This exchange matters, because this kind of perception is not as individual as it seems, it is more common than many people imagine. And if you know someone who keeps saying they can't ignore certain things anymore, share this video with that person. Sometimes one single conversation can organize something that has been confused for a very long time. And in the next video, we are going to go even deeper into this process of perception, because there are levels of this consciousness that almost no one talks about, and they completely change the way you interpret other people and yourself. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next video.